The air in the Ardennes forest didn't just feel cold. It felt solid. In December of 1944, with temperatures plunging to 13 degrees below zero, the very act of breathing was a painful, conscious effort. The cold was an enemy more relentless than any German patrol, an invisible force that seeped through uniforms and standard-issue blankets, as if they were made of lace. For the American soldiers dug into the frozen, rock-solid ground, their foxholes were not sanctuaries. They were shallow graves waiting to be filled. These military-approved shelters offered a cruel illusion of safety, shielding them from the wind, but pressing their bodies directly against an earth that acted like a massive block of ice, mercilessly siphoning away every last calorie of warmth. The ground itself was the enemy, a silent killer that operated by the simple, brutal laws of thermal conduction, and it was winning. Huddled in one of these icy pits was Corporal Harold Miller. At 24 years old, he was a farm boy from Montana, a place that knew its own harsh winters. But this was different. This was a cold that had a weight, a presence. He watched the men around him, their faces gaunt and their movements stiff, losing their fight against the creeping numbness. Every morning, more soldiers couldn't feel their fingers well enough to properly grip their rifles. Medics were evacuating men for frostbite and hypothermia at a rate that was starting to outpace combat injuries. Harold, with a practical stubbornness born from a life of relying on rural logic, knew something was fundamentally wrong. The Army's solution wasn't working. It defied common sense. He saw the truth clearly. Their platoon was being dismantled from the inside out, frozen into inaction without a single enemy shot being fired. What Harold Miller was about to do would look like madness to his fellow soldiers. He was going to build a shelter based on a principle so simple, yet so profoundly effective, that it had been completely overlooked by military engineers. It was a secret hidden not in a manual, but in a memory from his father's farm, a piece of ancestral knowledge about the Earth's own heat. This is the story of how that forgotten wisdom allowed a small group of soldiers to survive one of the most brutal winters in recorded history. On this channel, we unearth the survival skills that were buried by time and suppressed by progress. Subscribe so you don't miss the knowledge that has been proven to work when everything else fails. Before Harold could build his revolutionary shelter, he had to watch the standard methods push his unit to the absolute brink of collapse. The Battle of the Bulge was a desperate gamble, a last, furious offensive thrown by the German army. For the American forces caught in its path, survival was measured in yards of frozen earth and dwindling boxes of ammunition. The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was not a battlefield, it was a frozen hell. Supply lines were stretched to their breaking point, meaning warm meals, extra blankets, and medical supplies were a distant memory. The enemy was not just the soldiers hidden among the snow-laden pines, but the air itself. With temperatures consistently dropping between -4 and -13 degrees Fahrenheit, the ground became as unyielding as iron. Every shovel strike was a grueling effort that yielded little more than chips of frosted dirt. This was a war of attrition where the greatest weapon was the winter, and it was a weapon that targeted every single soldier, every single night, without mercy or pause. The very environment had become a force multiplier for the enemy, and the American command seemed to have no answer for it. The Army's doctrine for field shelters was tragically, fatally simple. The standard foxhole was a shallow trench, just deep enough to protect a man from shrapnel and machine gun fire. It was a design born from the muddy fields of the First World War, completely unsuited for this cryogenic battleground. The core failure was a misunderstanding of the enemy. The soldiers weren't just fighting the cold air, they were fighting the frozen ground itself. The earth, super-chilled for feet below the surface, acted as a massive, unending heat sink. Every moment a soldier spent in his foxhole, the ground was actively pulling the warmth from his body through the simple, brutal law of thermal conduction. Making matters worse, campfires were strictly forbidden. A single flicker of flame, a wisp of smoke, would be a beacon for German artillery. So the men were left with thin wool blankets and standard-issue greatcoats, defenses as useless against the profound cold as a paper shield against a bullet. The consequences of this failure were written on the faces and bodies of the men in Harold's platoon. Each morning was a grim roll call of misery. Men would awaken to find their fingers and toes had become useless, numb appendages they couldn't command. Holding a rifle, pulling a trigger, even buttoning a coat became monumental tasks. The medics were overwhelmed. More soldiers were being evacuated for severe frostbite and life-threatening hypothermia than for combat wounds. The platoon was being systematically dismantled, its fighting capability bleeding away into the frozen Belgian soil without a single shot being fired in its defense. It was a slow, agonizing defeat, not by bullets, but by degrees Fahrenheit. Harold watched as strong men were reduced to shivering, helpless invalids, their fighting spirit frozen solid long before their bodies finally gave out. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that if they continued to follow the book, none of them would last the winter. This wasn't just a physical battle, it was a psychological one. The foxhole, which should have been a symbol of safety and refuge, had become a place of dread. It was a cold, open grave that offered a cruel illusion of security while actively hastening their demise. The men were being told to trust a system that was visibly failing them, to dig their own icy tombs and hope for the best. For Harold Miller, a man raised on the practical wisdom of a Montana farm, this blind adherence to a flawed plan was a form of madness. He could feel the life being sapped from his own limbs each night. He saw the growing despair in the eyes of his comrades. The breaking point was near. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. The Army didn't have the answer. The manuals were wrong. The solution would have to come from somewhere else, from a place of forgotten knowledge that command had long since dismissed. The turning point for Harold Miller did not arrive with a shouted order or the crack of a rifle. It came in the dead of night, in the crushing silence of his foxhole, as the cold gnawed at his bones. Shivering uncontrollably, his mind drifted away from the frozen forest and back to the windswept plains of Montana. He saw his father, Thomas Miller, a man of few words but infinite practicality, standing at the edge of a freshly dug hole in the earth. It was their root cellar, dug deeper than any of their neighbors. Harold remembered asking why. His father had wiped the sweat from his brow, pointed down into the darkness, and said a phrase that now echoed in Harold's mind with the force of a revelation. The earth has its own heat if you dig deep enough. Below the frost line, winter can't touch you. In that moment, the entire military doctrine of shallow trenches seemed not just wrong, but suicidally ignorant. The solution wasn't in fighting the cold. It was in using the earth itself as a shield against it. The next morning, Harold began to work. He ignored the confused stares from his squad mates as he chose a spot between two thick pines and started digging. This wasn't going to be another shallow grave. This was a deliberate descent. His plan, born from that flash of memory, was based on a simple, powerful principle. First, he had to go down, straight down. The Army foxholes were wide and shallow, keeping the soldiers in direct contact with the top layer of earth, which was frozen solid to a depth of several feet. This frozen soil was the enemy, a massive block of ice sucking the life out of them. But below that frost line, the Earth's temperature remained remarkably stable, a constant somewhere between 32 and 41 degrees Fahrenheit. He needed to dig a vertical pit at least 4 feet deep, past the icy death zone and into the planet's own thermal reservoir. He wasn't trying to create heat. He was trying to stop losing it. But depth alone wasn't enough. A simple vertical pit would still fill with the frigid, heavy air from the outside. His father's root cellar had a clever design feature that Harold now understood with perfect clarity. He didn't dig a direct entrance. Instead, he excavated a separate, sloped tunnel that connected to the very bottom of the main chamber, forming an L shape. This design created a natural cold trap. Since cold air is denser and heavier than warm air, it would flow down the entrance tunnel and settle at its lowest point, unable to rise into the main living space. This simple configuration acted like an invisible door, keeping the relatively warmer air generated by his own body heat from escaping. For the roof, he would lay a lattice of thick branches, cover it with the earth he had excavated, and then scatter leaves and forest debris on top. This would provide massive insulation from the cold above and make the shelter completely invisible from both the ground and the air. With the plan clear in his mind, Harold drove his shovel into the unyielding ground. The work was brutal. The earth was like concrete, shattering into frozen shards with every impact. Each swing of his entrenching tool sent a jarring shock up his arms. This wasn't a quick fix. It was a grueling, calorie-burning investment in survival. His breath plumed in the frigid air as sweat froze on his brow. He was in a race against the setting sun, a race against the inevitable drop in temperature that night would bring. For hours, he worked in a focused silence, driven by a conviction that felt more real than the frozen ground beneath his feet. He wasn't just digging a hole. He was challenging a fatal order. He was betting his life on the forgotten wisdom of a Montana farmer against the entire weight of the United States Army's field manual. It was an act of profound defiance, carried out one painful shovelful at a time. His strange activity did not go unnoticed. His squad mates, huddled together for warmth, watched him with a mixture of pity and ridicule. "Digging your own grave, Miller," one of them called out, his voice thin in the cold air. They saw a man wasting his last reserves of energy on a foolish, pointless hole. Even his sergeant, a battle-hardened man named Patterson, came over to intervene. He wasn't angry, just concerned. "Miller, what in God's name are you doing?" he asked, his tone laced with exasperation. "You're wasting energy you'll need to stay alive tonight. The manual says dig wide, stay low. Stick to the book, son. It's what keeps us alive." But Harold just shook his head, his face set with determination. He couldn't explain the complex interplay of thermal mass and geothermal stability. He just knew, with a certainty that defied military logic, that the book was wrong. The book was killing them. As dusk settled over the Ardennes, Harold put the final touches on his shelter, camouflaging the earthen roof until it blended seamlessly with the forest floor. He crawled down the narrow entrance tunnel and into the dark, silent chamber. The difference was immediate and staggering. Outside, the temperature was already plummeting toward its nightly low of 13 degrees below zero. The wind howled through the pines. But inside his geothermal pit, the air was still and the biting cold was gone. It wasn't warm, not by any stretch, but it was a stable, survivable cold. He slept that night, a deep, restorative sleep unlike any he'd had in weeks. The next morning, he emerged into the gray dawn. His fingers worked. He could feel his toes. There was no frost clinging to his beard. He looked over at his squad mate, the same one who had mocked him, and saw the man fumbling with his canteen, his hands so numb they were like clumsy blocks of wood. The look on that man's face, a shocked, envious disbelief, was the first proof. The insane hole had worked. The initial proof was personal, a quiet victory against the cold. But the true test of Harold Miller's forgotten knowledge would not be a quiet one. It arrived 3 days later, not as a gradual drop in temperature, but as a full-scale assault from the heavens. A brutal blizzard descended upon the Ardennes, a swirling vortex of wind and snow that erased the world in a blanket of white. All military operations ground to a complete halt. The front lines vanished, replaced by an elemental war against a force that could not be shot at or outmaneuvered. The wind chill became the new enemy, a vicious, invisible blade that cut through every layer of clothing and morale. For the men hunkered down in their standard-issue foxholes, the next week would become an eternity of suffering, a slow-motion battle fought not for territory, but for every single degree of body heat. This was the crucible. Harold's theory, born from a farmer's wisdom, was about to be pitted against the absolute worst the Belgian winter could unleash. For the soldiers in the shallow trenches, the blizzard was a living nightmare. The wind howled with a malevolent intelligence, driving snow into every crevice of their shelters and freezing their wet uniforms into suits of icy armor. Their world shrank to a few feet of frozen earth, where the temperature inside their foxholes hovered at a miserable 5 degrees Fahrenheit. They were trapped, forced to press their bodies against the ground that was actively stealing their lives. The cold was no longer a discomfort. It was a physical torment that led to a terrifying numbness, a sign that the body was beginning to shut down. The grim reality of their situation became horrifyingly clear when word spread from a neighboring platoon. During the storm's peak, 4 of their men had to be evacuated, their feet and fingers showing the first dark signs of gangrene. They were losing the fight, not to the Germans, but to their own shelters. Morale didn't just plummet, it shattered. Meanwhile, in the silent, insulated darkness of their geothermal pits, Harold and the 2 men who had followed his lead experienced a different reality. They were cold, to be sure, but it was a stable, survivable cold, not the life-threatening agony being endured just a few yards away. They could hear the muffled roar of the blizzard raging above them, a distant threat sealed off by 4 feet of earth and a thick blanket of insulating snow. Inside their refuge, the temperature remained a constant, miraculous 32 degrees Fahrenheit. While the outside world dropped to a lethal 13 degrees below zero, their simple holes in the ground maintained a thermal environment that was a full 27 degrees warmer than the Army-approved foxholes. That 27-degree difference wasn't about comfort. It was the precise, measurable line between retaining your fingers and losing them to frostbite, the difference between emerging from the storm ready to fight and being carried away on a stretcher. When the storm finally broke after a week of relentless fury, the forest was a scene of devastation. Men emerged from their trenches like ghosts, their faces hollow, their movements stiff and agonizingly slow. But from 3 unremarkable mounds of earth, Harold Miller and his 2 converts crawled out, cold and stiff, but fundamentally intact. They were the only soldiers in the immediate vicinity who were combat ready. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that it could not be ignored. Captain Reynolds, witnessing the ravaged state of his company, saw the 3 men moving with purpose and demanded an explanation. He personally inspected Harold's shelter, crawling down into the L-shaped tunnel. He felt the absence of wind, the stable chill of the air. It was a moment of profound revelation. This wasn't insanity, it was genius. Standing in the snow, he looked at Harold, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. Then he turned to his men. The Miller method, he ordered, was to be replicated by the entire company. Immediately, the war ended. The world exhaled, and in the rush to rebuild and forget, countless truths were paved over. Harold Miller returned to his family farm in Montana, the horrors of the Ardennes a frozen memory he rarely spoke of. His ingenious shelter, a life-saving innovation born from desperation and ancestral wisdom, became just another battlefield anecdote, a story told and then forgotten. As America entered an age of unprecedented industrial and technological might, the military transformed alongside it. The focus shifted from the resilience of the individual soldier to the overwhelming power of the system. Solutions were no longer sought in the earth, but in factories. Prefabricated concrete bunkers, powerful fuel-based heating systems, and heavy earth-moving equipment became the new doctrine. The simple, elegant logic of the geothermal pit was deemed primitive, a last-resort technique that had no place in a modern, mechanized army. It wasn't that the knowledge was lost. It was deliberately retired, archived, and ignored, a testament to a time when survival depended on a man and a shovel, not a complex logistical supply chain. But this forgetting was not a passive process. It was the inevitable outcome of a system built on consumption. An army that can create its own super-effective shelters with nothing more than the tools on hand is an army that doesn't need to buy expensive, mass-produced bunker kits. It doesn't need to maintain vulnerable supply lines, shipping thousands of gallons of fuel to power heating units. Who benefited from this convenient amnesia? The industries that grew fat on military contracts. The construction companies, the equipment manufacturers, the oil corporations. The Miller method wasn't buried because it failed. It was buried because it worked too well with too little. It couldn't be patented, packaged, or sold. It fostered a dangerous level of self-reliance in the common soldier, making him less dependent on the very system designed to supply him. In a world where profit is made from dependency, true independence is never a product, it's a threat. This is why we work to unearth these skills, and why sharing this knowledge is an act of defiance against a system that prefers you remain a customer. For decades, the principle lay dormant, a ghost in the military archives, completely absent from commercial survival manuals that focused on selling high-tech tents and expensive sleeping bags. But a truth this fundamental cannot be erased forever. It can only be temporarily forgotten. Far from the halls of the Pentagon or the pages of glossy magazines, people began to rediscover it. In the quiet communities of survivalists, preppers, and natural builders, the timeless principles of thermal mass and passive geothermal design reemerged. They weren't uncovering a classified military secret. They were unearthing a piece of ancient human wisdom, the same wisdom that allowed Thomas Miller to keep his potatoes from freezing in the harsh Montana winter. They understood that the most powerful survival technology is not a piece of gear you can buy, but a piece of knowledge you possess. That quiet rediscovery continues today, a necessary rebellion proving that the ultimate tool for survival is, and always has been, the human mind working in harmony with the natural world. The story of Harold Miller is not a relic of the past. It is a blueprint for the future. Imagine a world, not in 1944, but next winter, where a severe storm or a systemic failure knocks out the power grid for weeks. Your furnace goes silent. The temperature inside your home begins to plummet, matching the bitter cold outside. In that moment, there will be two kinds of people. There will be those who huddle in their modern homes, which have suddenly become little more than beautifully decorated iceboxes, waiting for a system that has already failed them to come to their rescue. And then there will be those who understand the timeless principle Harold Miller remembered. They will look at the frozen ground not as an enemy, but as an ally. They will know that just a few feet beneath the deadly frost lies a constant, life-sustaining warmth. They possess the knowledge that separates victims from survivors, a knowledge that requires no electricity, no fuel, and no permission. This is the knowledge we work to unearth. It is a legacy that was intentionally set aside in favor of complex systems that create dependency. Every video on this channel is a piece of that legacy, recovered and restored for those who understand its true worth. If you believe that this kind of practical, proven wisdom is more valuable than any piece of gear you can buy, then join us in this mission. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you never miss another piece of this critical inheritance. Share this video with someone you care about, because knowledge is the only resource that grows when you give it away. By doing so, you are not just watching a story. You are becoming part of the effort to ensure these life-saving skills are never buried again. Help us build an archive for a future that might desperately need it. True preparedness is not about what you have. It is about what you know. When everything else fails, the earth endures.